They didn't just lose the war. In 1945, Allied intelligence classified one Nazi invention above nuclear weapons. Not destroyed, not denied, sealed. The official reason was never morality. It was containment. Because buried inside the ruins of the Third Reich were technology so advanced, so destabilizing, that the victors chose silence over disclosure. Devices seized under emergency orders. Blueprints removed from patent systems. Scientists reassigned, renamed, or erased. This is not about wonder weapons that failed. It's about systems that worked and were judged too dangerous for a post-war world already on the brink. The files exist. The gaps are measurable. The bans never expired. And if these inventions had entered open circulation, warfare, surveillance, medicine, and energy would look very different today. History says they vanished. The records say otherwise. Some weapons never stop working. When Nazi Germany collapsed in 1945, the war ended, but its research programs did not. As Allied forces moved east and west, they weren't just securing cities. They were racing for laboratories, filing cabinets, and people. What followed was not a single operation, but a global extraction system. Facilities were seized under military authority. Entire patent families were frozen. Engineers were transported under guard, often without public record. The public story was simple. The Reich's technology was reckless, immoral, and largely ineffective. That narrative endured because it was useful. But classified inventories tell a different story. One of unfinished prototypes, successful field tests, and theoretical work decades ahead of ethical frameworks meant to contain them. This documentary examines 10 Nazi inventions that share an unusual fate. They were not merely defeated or abandoned. They were interdicted across different domains: energy, chemistry, aerospace, biology, computation. The same pattern repeats. A discovery is made under state urgency. Evidence confirms viability, not fantasy. Then intervention, seizure orders, non-disclosure agreements, reassignment of personnel. Finally, silence, followed years later by quiet reappearance under different flags. This is not a story of hidden genius or retroactive admiration. It is a study in post-war control. Certain technologies threaten to accelerate history faster than governments could regulate it. Others collapse the line between civilian and military use. Some challenge existing treaties before those treaties even existed. And morality alone does not explain the bans. Why now? Because the timelines are closing. 80-year classification windows are expiring. Archive indexes released between 2023 and 2025 show missing annexes, redaction layers stacked on redaction layers, and recurring internal labels attached to unrelated projects, labels that were never meant to be seen together. One designation appears again and again, stamped lightly, almost casually, across seized files from different programs in different years. It does not describe a weapon. It describes oversight. And once you notice it, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore, because the first invention on this list was never designed to kill. And the first story is already classified. Die Glocke, the bell. In late 1944, deep in Lower Silesia, a device was assembled inside a fortified SS research complex. It was not a bomb. It was not an aircraft. It was suspended. Witnesses described it as bell-shaped, metallic, and encased within a reinforced frame. The project name was Die Glocke, the bell. Construction was overseen by SS General Hans Kammler, the same administrator responsible for advanced weapons programs and underground factories. The location was chosen for isolation, not secrecy. What was built there was never meant to be moved casually. Then the tests began, and people started dying. According to post-war testimonies and fragmentary documents, Die Glocke was powered by a rotating mechanism filled with a mercury-like substance, violet in color, radioactive, and unstable. It was codenamed Zerum 525. When activated, the device produced intense electromagnetic effects. Nearby equipment failed. Plants withered. Animals exposed to the field reportedly bled internally and died within minutes. The scans disagreed. The readings spiked. The instruments burned out. Lab notes recovered after the war described gravity anomalies and time distortion hypotheses. carefully worded, heavily qualified. This was not fantasy language. It was experimental caution. The data suggested a localized field effect that behaved unlike any known propulsion or energy system of the time. Engineers recorded results they could not explain and did not repeat often. Then came the intervention. By early 1945, Kamler ordered the site evacuated. Test personnel were reassigned or disappeared. Surviving scientists were forced to sign non-disclosure agreements under SS authority. As Allied forces approached, the facility was destroyed, not bombed but deliberately dismantled. Equipment vanished. Records were removed. What remained was buried under rubble and sealed. No one replied. The files ended. The trail went cold. After the war, Die Glocke did not appear in official inventories of captured German technology. Not once. Yet multiple Allied intelligence reports reference an unidentified power research program requiring special handling. Engineers linked to the project resurfaced years later in different countries, working on unrelated fields: energy systems, materials science, propulsion theory, never again connected to Die Glocke. One engineer's wife filed repeated inquiries. She never received a body. Only a compensation. Notice marked classified circumstances. The official position today is dismissal. Historians label Die Glocke a myth, a misunderstanding, or post-war exaggeration. But myths don't require seal files. And they don't require the same administrator overseeing both rocket programs and something never named. Because Die Glocke was not banned as a weapon. It was contained as a system. And by May 1945, it received a classification higher than most nuclear research. Classified at level V by May 1945. Sonnenjur, the sun gun. In 1941, while Europe burned below, German engineers were drawing weapons meant to operate above the atmosphere. The concept was called Sonnenjur, the sun gun. It was not science fiction. It was an orbital platform, a massive concave mirror designed to focus sunlight onto targets on Earth. Cities, ships, infrastructure, from space. It sounded impossible. That was the point. Impossible things draw less scrutiny. The proposal originated within the German Army Ordnance Office, supported by physicists already working on rocketry and high-altitude flight. The idea was simple in theory and terrifying in scale. A mirror array, kilometers wide, assembled in orbit, sunlight concentrated into a thermal beam. No explosives, no warning, no defense. The math was done. The angles checked out. The heat was sufficient. Surviving diagrams recovered from Peen-Mun show detailed orbital calculations, material requirements, and projected burn effects on ground targets. This was not a sketch. It was an engineering study. The limiting factor was not physics. It was launch capacity. Germany in 1941 could not lift the required mass into orbit, but the work continued anyway, because the weapon was not urgent. It was inevitable. Allied intelligence became aware of Sonnenjur late in the war through seized documents and interrogations. The response was immediate and quiet. The project was officially labeled theoretical, then removed from weapons assessments entirely. Funding trails vanished. No prototypes were listed. No scientists were credited. Then the files were marked. Across multiple Sonnenjur documents appears a small, easily overlooked designation. Not a weapon code. Not a unit number. An internal oversight stamp applied after seizure. Project Thor. No explanation was attached. After 1945, several scientists associated with orbital weapon concepts were transferred to Allied space and missile programs. Their work shifted focus, from weapons to communications, from mirrors to solar research. Publicly, Sonnenjur was dismissed as Nazi fantasy. Privately, its core principle, space-based energy projection, never disappeared. The patents never appeared. The calculations were never published. The idea was never disproven. One junior astronomer involved in the thermal modeling lost his position after the war. He applied to 3 universities. All rejected him without explanation. He spent the rest of his career teaching secondary school physics. He died before satellites became common. His students never knew. Today, Space-based solar power is discussed openly, framed as clean energy. Directed energy systems are described as defensive. The language is softened. The math has not changed. And Sonninger remains officially categorized as non-viable. But non-viable ideas do not require classification tags applied across multiple agencies. They do not share oversight labels with unrelated projects. And they do not resurface quietly in post-war space doctrine under different names. Because Sonninger was never banned for what was in 1941. It was banned for what it would become. Reference an Allied seizure memo, June 1946. V3 Hochdruckpumpe, the supergun. In 1943, on the chalk cliffs of northern France near Mimoyex, Germany began constructing a weapon that did not resemble artillery. It had no single barrel, no visible breech. Instead, it was a buried network, angled shafts, side chambers, and reinforced tunnels carved directly into bedrock. The name was clinical Hochdruckpumpe, high-pressure pump. The Allies would later call it the V3. This gun was designed to fire shells from France into London, not once, continuously. The principle was simple and brutal, along the length of an extended barrel. Secondary charges would ignite in sequence, accelerating projectile again and again as it traveled forward. Each detonation added velocity. Each chamber multiplied range. On paper, it worked. In tests, it worked too well until the barrel failed. The design note survived. The blast marks remain. The geometry is measurable. Reconnaissance photos and post-war site inspections confirm the scale. Multiple firing shafts, each aligned with precision. Ammunition elevators. Power systems. This was not a prototype. It was an installation. When the RAF finally attacked Mimoyex in July 1944, they didn't bomb it conventionally. They used tall boy earthquake bombs, specifically chosen to collapse underground structures. That choice mattered, because what worried Allied planners wasn't accuracy. It was volume. The V-3 was intended to fire hundreds of rounds per day. Even with limited precision, the psychological and infrastructural impact would have been immediate. Civilian centers under constant bombardment. No warning sirens. No aircraft to intercept. Then the project disappeared. After the war, the V-3 was officially categorized as a failure, an impractical weapon overtaken by events. The site was sealed. The surviving components were removed. But the underlying principle, multi-stage acceleration, did not vanish. It was reclassified. Technical summaries seized from German archives were distributed to multiple Allied research divisions, artillery teams, ballistics labs, early spaceflight groups. One internal report does not label the system a weapon at all. It calls it a long tube acceleration platform. The language changed. The math stayed. Stamped on several of these redistributed documents is a familiar mark. Small, administrative, applied after seizure, not before Project Thor. The same oversight designation found on unrelated energy and orbital research files. No explanation followed. One forced laborer who survived the Mimoyex site testified years later. He described endless drilling, constant collapses, men buried without records. His brother died in the tunnels. There was no grave, only a number on a transport list. The official narrative insists the V-3 taught nothing new. But within a decade, the same acceleration logic appeared in launch assist systems and experimental space cannons, now stripped of context and origin, because the Hochdruckpumpe was not just a gun. It was a method, and once methods work, they don't stay buried. Suppression extended to civilian patents, August 1947. Nerve agents, tabun and sarin. In 1936, inside a chemical laboratory operated by I.G. Farben, a German chemist synthesized a compound that was never intended to be a weapon. It was meant to kill insects. Instead, it interfered with the human nervous system at the molecular level. The compound was called tabun. What followed was not an accident. It was recognition. Within months, the German military classified the discovery and expanded the research. Tabun was joined by sarin and later soman, colorless, odorless nerve agents far more lethal than anything used in the First World War. These substances did not burn lungs or scar skin. They shut down the body's ability to regulate itself. Muscles seized. Breathing stopped. Consciousness often remained until the end. The data was precise. The lethality curves were mapped. The dosages were terrifyingly small. Unlike many experimental weapons, nerve agents reached full industrial production. Factories were built. Stockpiles were filled. Delivery methods were tested. By 1945, Nazi Germany possessed thousands of tons of nerve agents, enough to change the course of the war if deployed. They never were. That restraint was not ethical. It was strategic. German leadership feared retaliation in kind. But the Allies did not share that uncertainty once the war ended. When the factories were captured, the response was immediate and coordinated. The existence of nerve agents was suppressed from public knowledge. Entire chemical plants were dismantled under military guard. Samples were seized. Scientists were interrogated, then reassigned. The intervention was total. Post-war reports framed Tabun and sarin as dangerous aberrations, too horrific to ever be used. Yet they were not destroyed outright. They were studied, replicated, improved. Western and Soviet laboratories quietly integrated nerve agents into their own chemical weapons programs while publicly condemning them. Treaties came later. Condemnations followed. The silence came first. One junior lab technician involved in early synthesis collapsed during an exposure incident. He survived, but with permanent neurological damage. He was discharged without explanation. His medical records were sealed. He spent the rest of his life unable to hold a cup steady. Today, nerve agents are cited as a line civilization agreed never to cross. But that line was drawn after knowledge was absorbed, standardized, and distributed among major powers. The ban was not preventative. It was retrospective. And that distinction matters, because Tabun and sarin were not erased from history. They were absorbed, then locked behind international agreements that assumed no one else would ever rediscover them independently, which is why their names still trigger emergency protocols, and why their origins remain carefully summarized and rarely examined. International Chemical Weapons Conventions drafted in response, 1947 to 1950. Acoustic and sonic weapons. In 1942, German military researchers began testing weapons that left no shrapnel and no smoke. The goal was control, not destruction. These were acoustic weapons, systems designed to incapacitate human beings using sound and vibration rather than explosives. The research took place across several small laboratories, often attached to medical institutes to avoid attention. The premise was straightforward. Certain frequencies, when amplified, could cause disorientation, nausea, panic, and loss of motor control. Others interfered with the inner ear. Some targeted the chest cavity itself. The rooms were sealed. The tones were calibrated. The reactions were logged. Surviving test records described subjects exposed to sustained low-frequency sound waves. Symptoms appeared quickly: vertigo, internal pressure, involuntary muscle spasms. In some cases, temporary blindness. The most effective frequencies were not loud in the traditional sense. They were felt, not heard. The subjects couldn't explain it. They just collapsed. These experiments never produced a battlefield weapon before the war ended. No deployable device was issued. That fact later became the official explanation for dismissal. Post-war summaries labeled the work impractical, inefficient, or psychologically exaggerated. But the data was still seized. Allied intelligence units collected frequency tables, generator designs, and physiological response charts. The files were reassigned from weapons divisions to biomedical research. The language changed. The purpose did not. Internal memos described potential applications in crowd control and area denial. The suppression was subtle. No public ban was announced. Instead, the research was quietly absorbed and reframed as defensive or non-lethal. The original German programs were never acknowledged as predecessors. Their scientists were redirected into unrelated acoustics work, stripped of context and credit. One test subject, a conscripted medical orderly, lost most of his hearing after repeated exposure. He was discharged without pension. He never worked in medicine again. He communicated by writing notes for the rest of his life. One could argue these experiments were crude, their effects overstated, and their military value limited by the technology of the time. But decades later, similar principles reappeared in officially sanctioned long-range acoustic devices used for perimeter defense and crowd dispersal, now marketed as humane alternatives. The frequencies match. The symptoms match. The denials match. What was once dismissed as ineffective became acceptable once it could be controlled and branded. The ethical concerns shifted from capability to optics, because sound leaves no ruins, no blast craters, no photographs, and that made it useful. Reclassified under Biomedical Research Protocols, 1948. Jet rocket hybrid propulsion. By 1944, Germany was already flying the world's first operational jet fighters. That fact is not disputed. What is less discussed is what came next. Engines designed to operate as both jet and rocket, switching modes mid-flight to overcome the limits of altitude, speed, and fuel. The problem was clear. Jet engine performed well at speed, but struggled at extreme altitude. Rockets delivered raw thrust, but burned fuel at unsustainable rates. German engineers attempted to bridge the gap with hybrid systems that could transition between air-breathing and oxidizer-fed propulsion. The concept worked on paper. Then it worked on test stands. Then it left the ground. Documents recovered after the war describe experimental variants of the Me-262 and other late-war aircraft fitted with auxiliary rocket boosters and prototype combined-cycle engines. The goal was interception. Climb faster than enemy bombers, strike, and disengage before escort fighters could respond. Flight logs note extreme acceleration. Short test windows. Unstable but controllable profiles. These aircraft never reached full production. Fuel shortages, bomb factories, and the collapsing war ended the program. Official histories later framed the hybrids as desperate improvisations, dangerous, inefficient, and inferior to conventional designs. That framing did not survive contact with post-war reality. Allied evaluation teams were stunned by the performance envelopes described in German test data. Engineers were less interested in the airframes than in the propulsion logic. Within months, personnel connected to these programs were transferred to the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union under special technical visas. Their assignments changed. Their names were simplified. Their past work disappeared. One propulsion specialist who had worked on transition engines arrived in the U.S. in 1946. His early reports were classified. He never published under his own name again. Colleagues recall him as precise, withdrawn, and careful with words. He died before seeing his concepts openly acknowledged. Within 2 decades, combined-cycle propulsion reemerged, now called mixed-mode engines, afterburning turbojets, and later scramjet precursors. The terminology evolved. The lineage was severed. The original German research was never credited. No patents were honored. In some cases, civilian applications were explicitly blocked to prevent disclosure of military origins. This was not a ban on flight. It was a ban on continuity. Because acknowledging how far these systems had progressed in 1944 would have raised uncomfortable questions about who really led aerospace development, about how much was taken, not reinvented, and about why certain engineers were told, explicitly, never to speak about what they had already made fly. Blueprints transferred across 3 nations, 1946 to 1948. Early computing and encryption machines. In the final years of the war, inside universities and converted factories across Germany, machines were built to think faster than humans could calculate. Not metaphorically. Mechanically, these were not ciphers alone. They were early computers. Most people know Enigma. Fewer know what came after. German engineers developed a series of electromechanical and programmable calculating machines intended to solve ballistics tables, logistics planning, and encryption at speeds no human team could match. The most advanced of these, machines in the Z series, use binary logic, relays, and modular programming concepts that would not become standard in the West for years. They worked. They were unstable. They were real. Surviving schematics show memory registers, conditional branching, and automated input. These were not adding machines. They were general-purpose systems, limited only by reliability and wartime materials. Test operators reported calculations completed in minutes that previously took days. The implications were obvious. So was the danger. As Allied forces advanced, computing facilities were prioritized for seizure. Entire machines were dismantled and shipped in crates. Others were destroyed in place. What survived entered intelligence channels, not academic ones. The work was instantly classified, not as mathematics, but as strategic infrastructure. Inventors were handled carefully. Some were interrogated, then sidelined. Others were quietly absorbed into post-war research labs under supervision. Their publications stopped abruptly. Their names vanished from conference records. One engineer who had designed a modular control unit applied for patent protection in 1946. The application was rejected on national security grounds. No alternative credit was offered. He returned to civil engineering. His computing work was never cited during his lifetime. Official histories later credited post-war breakthroughs in computing to independent reinvention. That story required omission. German machines were described as curiosities, too fragile to matter. But fragility does not negate priority. Declassified Allied reports from the late 1940s refer to seized German computing devices as conceptually disruptive. That phrase appears more than once. It does not describe failure. It describes timing. Because widespread programmable computation would have collapsed existing advantages in cryptography, weapons design, and surveillance. Control depended on scarcity. These machines threatened abundance. So the response was not celebration. It was sequestration. The technology was not banned outright. It was redirected into classified military systems, intelligence analysis, and closed research environments. The civilian path was delayed. By the time computers entered public life, their origin story had already been simplified, and some of the earliest chapters have been deliberately left out. Seized under intelligence priority, October 1945. Human enhancement and stimulant programs, climax zone. By 1943, German military planners were no longer asking how to build better weapons. They were asking how to change the human using them. The research was fragmented by design. Army medicine, aviation physiology, naval endurance labs, separate facilities, shared objectives. The goal was performance, wakefulness without fatigue, aggression without hesitation, focus under impossible stress. The substances already existed. They were refined, then systematized. The most widely issued stimulant was Pervitin, a methamphetamine distributed to pilots, tank crews, and infantry units. But that was only the surface layer. Internal documents describe experimental compounds intended to regulate fear response, suppress pain, and extend cognitive function during prolonged operations. The data was clinical. The results were measurable. The costs were ignored. Medical logs recovered after the war show soldiers operating for days without sleep. Reaction times improved. Risk tolerance increased. So did dependency. Withdrawal symptoms were severe. Psychosis was documented. Cardiac failure followed in some cases. Then the research crossed a line. Late war experiments shifted from chemistry to neurology, EEG monitoring, stress inoculation, early attempt to map and manipulate cognitive thresholds. The language was cautious, but the intent was clear. Identify how far a human could be pushed before breaking, and how to push them further. The subjects were never volunteers. After 1945, Allied investigators classified these programs as unethical and unscientific. Publicly, they were dismissed as barbaric excess. Privately, the records were seized intact, not destroyed, not condemned, transferred, and stamped. For the first time, the oversight designation appears in full context. Project Thor, not attached to a device, not to a weapon, attached to human performance optimization files across multiple branches. Oversight, not authorship. From here, the pattern accelerates. Personnel linked to these programs were reassigned to post-war aviation medicine, spaceflight physiology, and military psychology units. The research focus narrowed. The methods were cleaned. The outcomes were renamed. Fatigue resistance, stress tolerance, operational readiness. One former test subject, a teenage conscript, survived repeated stimulant trials. After the war, he could not sleep without medication. He suffered violent tremors. He died before 40. His medical file was reclassified twice. The official position today is selective amnesia. Yes, stimulants were used. Yes, abuses occurred. But the idea that Nazi-era research influenced modern military human performance programs is described as exaggerated. Then the documents contradict that comfort. Identical dosage tables, identical cognitive benchmarks, identical warnings verbatim. The cadence tightens because the realization lands hard. This was not about drugs. It was about optimization. And Project Thor did not exist to suppress failure. It existed to manage success that could not be explained publicly. Because once warfare shifts from tools to people, bands become fragile. Ethics lag behind advantage. And oversight becomes permanent. By 1947, these files were no longer labeled German. They were labeled ongoing. Transferred to Allied Biomedical Command under Project Thor, April 1947. Weather manipulation and atmospheric experiments, climax zone. In the final phase of the war, as defeat became unavoidable, German researchers turned their attention upward, not to aircraft, but to the atmosphere itself. The idea was not mystical. It was strategic. If weather could be influenced, even locally, it could ground bombers, blind reconnaissance, or disrupt naval operations without firing a shot. German meteorological institutes began coordinating with military research offices to study cloud formation, ionization, and atmospheric electrical behavior. The language was careful. The scope was not. Surviving correspondence described experiments involving cloud seeding agents, high-voltage atmospheric probes, and attempts to influence pressure systems over limited regions. The goal was not control of storms, but interference, small nudges with outsized consequences. Test results were inconsistent, but some anomalies repeated, and that was enough. Weather stations recorded sudden deviations during test windows. Cloud density shifted faster than models predicted. Aircraft reported unexpected icing and turbulence in otherwise stable conditions. None of it was definitive. All of it was logged. Then the war ended, and the files did not scatter. Instead, they converged. Allied seizure teams gathered meteorological data, lab notes, and equipment from multiple sites. These materials were not routed through standard weapons assessment channels. They were handled separately, under a classification tier normally reserved for nuclear research. The oversight stamp appears again. Clear this time. Undeniable. Project Thor, authorization dated March 1945. The same designation previously attached to orbital energy concepts, acceleration platforms, and human performance research now govern atmospheric experimentation. Different domains. Same control mechanism. After 1945, public statements dismissed Nazi weather research as speculative and ineffective. Meteorology was framed as too complex to manipulate. That message persisted for decades. Behind closed doors, the research continued, now under Allied supervision. Post-war military projects explored cloud seeding for logistics and battlefield concealment. Atmospheric testing expanded alongside nuclear weapons programs, justified as measurement but doubling as experimentation. The original German data was cited internally, stripped of origin. One lead researcher connected to the wartime atmospheric program vanished in 1947. No death record. No trial. His name stopped appearing in academic journals. Colleagues later said his office was emptied overnight. His family received no explanation. By the time weather modification entered public discourse in the 1950s and 1960s, the groundwork had already been laid. The ethical debate lagged behind capability. The terminology softened. Research, modeling, environmental study. But the control architecture remained. Because influencing the atmosphere does not require certainty. It requires plausibility, deniability, and time. And Project Thor was designed for exactly that. The pattern is no longer theoretical. Energy, acceleration, humans, weather, different fronts of the same question. How much advantage is too much to admit? By the late 1940s, this question no longer belonged to Germany. It belonged to whoever inherited the silence. Classified beyond nuclear protocols, Level V, 1948. Directed energy and the final suppression, hinge. In the last months of the war, as conventional defeat closed in, German weapons research narrowed its focus. Not on range, not on yield, on delivery without contact. The concept was called directed energy. It did not rely on bullets or shells. It relied on focused electromagnetic output. Energy shaped, aimed, and sustained long enough to disable targets without physical impact. Aircraft electronics, guidance systems, possibly human nervous function. The ambition was not destruction. It was interdiction. Fragments of the program surfaced only indirectly. Allied recovery teams documented unusual components seized from abandoned facilities, high-capacity capacitors, precision waveguides, experimental emitters unlike radar, but related to it. These parts were cataloged, then removed from standard inventories. No complete device was ever displayed. No schematic was released in full. The absence was deliberate. Internal Allied summaries refer to a non-kinetic neutralization concept originating in late-war German research. The phrase appears once, then never again. Instead, the materials were split, some sent to electronics labs, others to aerospace commands, others to intelligence research units. And overseeing the distribution was a familiar designation, Project Thor, not as a research label, as a Terminal 1. Here, Thor no longer meant oversight of development. It meant containment of convergence. Too many lines were crossing. Energy projection overlapped with propulsion. Propulsion overlapped with space. Space overlapped with surveillance. Surveillance overlapped with people. The system was becoming visible. One engineer associated with high-frequency emitter design was relocated with his family in 1946. New names, new records. His later work appeared under defense contracts in a different country, focused on signal interference. He never acknowledged his earlier research. His children were told he had been an accountant. Another technician simply vanished from personnel lists. No reassignment, no obituary. His clearance file ends with a single word, resolved. By the early Cold War, directed energy reappeared under new language, electronic warfare, jamming, active denial, each framed as defensive, each carefully limited in public description. The original lineage was never discussed, because this was the moment the pattern locked. 10 different inventions, 10 different domains, one identical response, not destruction, not rejection, absorption followed by silence. Project Thor does not appear in post-war treaties. It does not appear in textbooks. It appears only where programs overlap and explanations fail. And in one declassified index, dated 1949, it carries a final note attached to multiple files from different origins. Status, ongoing. Public acknowledgement, not advised. That is the hinge, because bans are supposed to end. Classifications expire. Secrets age out. This one didn't. And that forces a final question, not about what Nazi Germany built, but about what the world decided to keep. Because if these inventions were truly impossible, they wouldn't have needed to disappear. And if they were truly evil, they wouldn't have been reused. Project Thor listed as ongoing in 1949 archival index. By now, a pattern should be clear. These inventions were not erased because they failed. They were erased because they converged. Energy, propulsion, biology, computation, atmosphere, separate lines collapsing into a single problem. Control without visibility. That is what frightened post-war planners. Not a bell-shaped device, not a mirror in orbit, not a chemical formula, but the realization that once certain thresholds are crossed, progress stops being negotiable. It accelerates beyond law, ethics, and consent. And when that happens, the only remaining tool is silence. One could argue none of this proves continuity. That these were crude wartime ideas, rediscovered later by chance. That similar conclusions simply emerge when smart people face the same problems. That argument is clean, it is comforting, and it fails under paperwork. Because independent reinvention does not require seizure orders. It does not require lifelong non-disclosure. It does not require the same oversight designation stamped across unrelated fields. Project Thor was never a weapon program. It was a decision that some knowledge, once demonstrated, could not be allowed to enter open history. Not yet, maybe not ever. The unsettling question is not whether Nazi Germany built these things. It's why the world chose to keep them. Because the technology can be absorbed, renamed, and buried once, it can happen again. And not just with weapons, with medicine, energy, surveillance, even the definition of what a human can endure. The final stake is not academic. It is personal. What you know shapes the future you're allowed to imagine for your children, for your society, for yourself. So this archive leaves you with a choice. Accept that history is complete and settled, or recognize that some chapters were never closed, only classified. Archive it or burn it.